Okay, back to the strategising. Jacob White is the Development and Partnerships Manager at Equality Australia, and they will now introduce our final keynote address for the day. Could you please welcome Jacob White?
Hello, how are we all? I hope Jeremy Fernandez won't mind that I stole his outfit. Good afternoon, my name is Jacob White, and along with Anna Brown and our broader team, I'm responsible for the development of Equality Australia as a national voice for our LGBTQI+ communities. And today it is my great honour to introduce Justice Edward Cameron to the Human Rights Conference. I would like to acknowledge that we're meeting today on the lands of the Gadigal and would like to take this opportunity to express my deep personal support for voice, treaty and truth, and the recognition of First Nations people in the founding document of this country, our Constitution. And that's relevant because our next speaker knows a thing or two about foundational national documents. A proud South African, Edward Cameron has dedicated his life to supporting the South African people in their struggle for democracy and self-determination. As a judge, Edwin has served a cumulative 25 years on the highest courts in his native South Africa, including the High Court, the Supreme Court, and as a justice on the South African Constitutional Court. Edwin Cameron is both the hero of democracy and a giant of our movement. As a young human rights lawyer during the apartheid, he worked tirelessly defending the rights of our most vulnerable members of our rainbow community. That work created the backdrop for his contributions to the drafting of the South African Constitution, which saw the historic inclusion of our communities in that country's founding document. Today, though, I've been asked to introduce Edwin to speak about a particular aspect of his life and his advocacy. Apart from being a proud South African, Edwin is also a proud advocate for people living with HIV. Edwin's honesty, openness, vulnerability in speaking about his HIV and using his privileged position as a platform to create change is nothing short of breathtaking. In a compulsion that will be familiar to many in this room, the extremities of his illness has underscored the boldness of his advocacy. In the time since Edwin became positive in the 1980s, the HIV epidemic has changed more than any of us could ever have imagined. And in this country, we are on the cusp of eliminating new HIV infections entirely, something completely inconceivable when I contracted HIV 15 years ago. We have made remarkable progress, but as I absorbed Edwin's story in preparation for these remarks, I was struck by how many of his experiences were so painfully familiar to me and those of us who are newly diagnosed with HIV today. It struck me that while so much has changed, so much remains the same. It was 15 years ago that I became HIV positive. That's half of my entire life. And this time next year, I will have spent more time living with HIV than I have without. What happened to me is known as an intentional HIV infection, which means that someone went out of their way to deliberately infect me with HIV. And they were successful. I know this is what happened because they told me so. This is a cruel and dehumanising act that is difficult for any good-natured person to understand. But there are people out there who get off on the power that this gives them over others. The shame and the stigma that gives these criminals their kick is the same shame and stigma that prevents their victims from speaking out and seeking treatment. It is the cycle of shame and stigma that prevented me from doing anything about my own infection. After realising what had happened to me, scared and afraid, I buried my head in the sand and did nothing about it. By the time I was 19, I had an advanced HIV infection, a viral count in the tens of millions, and an immune system comparable to someone in their 90s. I was 19. To use Edwin's words, I knew what was happening to my body, but I postponed, I prevaricated, I suppressed, and I denied. Just like Edwin, I left the treatment of my illness to a point where I'd begun to develop symptoms of AIDS and I could physically wait no longer. That is the power of stigma, and that is the power of shame. Despite the miraculous advances in medical science, those twin forces continue to inflict great harm on our community, on our entire rainbow community. Edwin will speak about the importance of visibility and the role that brave advocates have played in advancing landmark reforms on behalf of our community. For me, visibility is about pride and acceptance. It's about courage and leadership. It is about being true to ourselves and about living and breathing the image of the world that we want to see, the world we want to live in, and the world that we're all here fighting for. Visibility matters because there are so many more of us than our detractors want us to believe, because they know that our collective power is greater than the sum of our parts, because they know our collective They know that the power can only be realised when we all stand together equally. That is why we must not let ourselves be divided. Our detractors know we are too small in numbers to fight these fights alone. It cannot be the HIV community, it cannot be the intersex community, and it cannot be the trans community or any one group of us fighting these fights alone. It must be all of us. We must all stand together and we must all remain united. That is why we need to be kind to one another. We need to be open to the experiences of others within our rainbow community. We need to engage with each other with open hearts and open minds. Effective movements are bound together by forces of unity, not by forces of division. And it's going to take a movement that includes all of us to fend off the attacks and protect the gains. And that is what we're building here at this conference, a movement. As we've been reminded, though, one of the greatest challenges we face as progressives and change makers is humankind's dangerous and persistent inability to learn the lessons of the past. The twists and turns of histories have demonstrated time and time again that the arc of progress is not linear. It can sometimes feel like every giant leap forward, there is a devastating retreat backwards. Edwin's story tragically captures this all too well. Born and raised in apartheid, his younger years were spent advancing the rights of his fellow South Africans. He went on to play a foundational role in the birth of a democracy, and now, today, Edwin bears witness to the tragic descent into dysfunction and the realignment of his country with some of the world's most destructive and despotic regimes. All of this in his lifetime. That is a confronting story of the fragility of progress and the need to staunchly defend it and vigorously advance it. So the task ahead of us is clear. Those of us who enjoy privileged lives in this world have a special responsibility to speak up and speak out to ensure our beautiful rainbow community takes no steps backwards. There must be no U-turns. I know that duty weighs heavily on me, and I know it weighs heavily on everyone gathered in this room today. Edwin, thank you for being visible and creating some of that space for us, and thank you for your service to our rainbow community and to democracy. It is my absolute honour to introduce Edwin Cameron.